Good afternoon, everybody. Buon pomeriggio a tutti. I welcome you to the second day of this conference on Mediterranean security affairs on its various angles. Yesterday we had two sessions and they had been very successful. We had more than 400 people connected with us. I'm very proud about that, and I thank the people who connected with us. This is the second day. We have a special intervention now by the Deputy Secretary General of the Union for Mediterranean, Gramenos Mastroianni, who will address, I believe, those issues in a comprehensive way, because the Union for the Mediterranean was established not so many years ago and is really now becoming more and more active and also interested in specific projects and connected the Mediterranean. So I'm very happy to introduce Ambassador and Deputy Secretary General Mastroianni. You have the floor.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me first thank the organizers for giving voice to the Union for the Mediterranean. This is the only international organization that has in its mandate the Mediterranean as a whole. I'm not saying that as a way of institutional propaganda. Problem. Thank you. A small technical accident. Indeed, the Mediterranean is segmented. According to the United Nations divisions, the Mediterranean enters into three geographical competences. States tend to tackle the Mediterranean, dividing it between east and west. We look at it as a whole, as a pan-Mediterranean unity. And indeed, it is a unity. It is an historical, cultural, economic unity, and it has its own unity in the dynamics of climate change, which is the big challenge for the years to come. Climate change is maybe the starting point to tackle the problem of energy in the Mediterranean. Our region is the second fastest warming in the world if we consider atmospheric temperature. It is the fastest warming mass of waters in the world, and with this awareness come a lot of disquieting forecasts. We are expecting impacts like 250 million people in water scarcity within no more than 15 years. We are expecting a sea level rise around 20 centimeters, which might seem not so disquieting, but 20 centimeters means the salinization of agricultural lands around the coasts, including the salinization of the Nile Delta, which means jeopardizing the agriculture of a country with more than 100 million, with almost 100 million inhabitants. But this is not the whole story. The Mediterranean is a history of unity in culture, unity in economy, but what unity? It is a unity of asymmetry, which can be described just quoting the data about international commerce in our region. Of all international exchanges around the Mediterranean, 90% happens between states on the North Stream, 9% between the North and the South, and only 1% among southern states. It tells a lot about a region in which there are those who can and those who can't. But even quoting a collection of disquieting predictions doesn't tell the whole story. Climate change over the Mediterranean is actually altering the whole balance and the whole identity of the region. If you look at Europe and North Africa, there are some anomalies we don't really realize. Europe in itself shouldn't be a continent. If you apply the criteria through which we have divided all the other continents, Europe should not exist. It's just the tip of Asia. And even North Africa, it is Africa, but it is not Africa. There is something peculiar that establishes an identity there which is not defined by geographical boundaries. And as Montesquieu had already understood more than 2 centuries ago, probably our common denominator is a special climate, an incredibly favorable climate that enabled the agricultural revolution, the most important revolution in human history, to take place in the Mediterranean. Now this is changing. Instead of a stable, predictable, and sweet climate, we are having our area divided in 2 parts, because African anticyclones are entering into the realm that used to belong to the Azores anticyclones. It means that Europe itself is divided in 2, that there are new connections between Southern Europe and Northern Africa, and there are new divisions in the middle of Europe. It seems so abstract, but let me just give you an example. The fastest warming area in the world is the Arctic. It comes with a lot of problems, but also with some advantages. For instance, the forecasted opening of new maritime routes. We are very happy if our friends in the north, together with all the problems brought by an accelerated warming, can benefit by some advantages. But if these routes, the Northwest Passage and the Northeast Passage, become effective, it means that the Suez Canal isn't worth anything anymore. That ports in the Mediterranean lose part of their values. At the same time, we have assisted to new solidarities. For instance, in the forestry sector. The forestry sector has started cooperating a lot more between the north and the south. Is it because of environmental awareness? For sure, but also because there is a subjacent awareness that we need each other. In the north, we will need the crops and the species which are vital and productive now in the south, and we will need them in just 10, 50 years to have our economies survive. So in this whole Mediterranean identity, what is the role of energy? Well, energy still lives a contradiction. Energy is a commodity in the market, playing according to market rules. At the same time, energy is an enabler of development, important in rebalancing that asymmetry that I quoted before. And energy is essential in the respect of human rights. If the energy sector sees what's going to happen, it might come to the conclusion that at this stage there is no contradiction between playing by the rules of the market and playing by the rules of society, adaptation to climate change. Not only because if we let climate change become a disruptive factor, there will be no market, but also because in the end it's more convenient, it makes more revenue to rush and secure those values which are needed. I've told you all this abstract story to introduce you to the approach of the Union for the Mediterranean to the energy problem in our region. And I can resume this approach in one word. Facing this common challenge, we realized that no one, not even the strongest around the Mediterranean, has enough resources to face and cope with the problems to come on its own. So we need each other. And the energy sector is essential through one solution, which is interconnection. Physical interconnection of grids, but also regulatory interconnection, interconnection between the north and the south. I was talking to the European Commission a couple of weeks ago, and together we recognized that there will be no Green Deal inside Europe without the participation of the South. Just very practically, zero carbon or carbon neutrality cannot be reached within Europe if we do not rely, for those uses which are not connected to the grid, on green hydrogen. But we cannot have green hydrogen without relying on the solar capacity of the South. At the same time, we need interconnection between southern states. We need a transition towards renewables, but although you have a lot of potential in generating renewable energy, they still need to be backed by grids, traditional grids. National grids are not enough to perform that duty. They have to be interconnected. We need interconnection in technologies, which is not only modern industrial technology coming as a God-given gift from the north. In the south, they have an experience that we will badly need. thousands and thousands of years of experience in coping with drylands, just as our lands will become. We need to put together knowledge. So what is our hope at the Union of the Mediterranean? With the objective of tackling climate change, if we do all we need to tackle climate change, even if it's not our objective, we will end up solving the everlasting problem of the Mediterranean, a sea of civilization, a sea of exchanges, but which has never completely been a sea of security and peace. What do we need to do? Put together forces. But putting together forces means rebalancing inequalities, means a participatory economy, and it means wiping out all the root causes of those conflicts that have made our sea so fantastic, but at the same time, never a sea of peace. In face of this ultimate challenge, if we do what we have to do, especially through the sector of energy, that demonstrates us that we need each other, we will maybe be able to adapt to climate change, mitigate climate change, but by doing that, we will do exactly what we need to reach what we have never been able to reach, which is peace. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much to the organizers.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the third session of Energy Strategies of the event of the NATO Defense College Foundation. So this afternoon, we will be speaking about the interaction between networks and energy security. We have a panel, which I will present to you soon. When I was asked to moderate this panel, the first thing that came to mind were a number of contradictions. When we talk about this, I look at energy and the Middle East, and we'll speak specifically about North Africa also. The first contradiction that comes to mind for me is that between instability and stability. Energy has been a factor, obviously, for years, for decades, maybe for centuries, if we go back to starting in the late 1800s, which has generated, obviously, political and strategic fights, struggles, and a certain amount of instability. Today, the goal of what we want to talk about is how the transition, in particular towards sustainable energy, broader networks can lead to stability. This is an interesting idea, one which we will explore with our panelists. Secondly, there's the question again of a contradiction or a paradox between economics and politics. We have political goals in terms of energy. We're talking about what the European Union can do, what NATO can do to help the Mediterranean also benefit. There are political goals which drive economic decisions, but then there is the market. And this raises a paradox. We've seen, for example, in the United States, the energy revolution, the shale revolution in recent years, which in a certain sense has done more to reduce CO2 than pushing towards renewables. So we find sometimes the market and economics without the political direction actually makes progress. So this is another issue which we'll be able to talk about with our panelists. So first of all, let me just present who we have here with us today. Some of them are connected. Two of them are here in person. We have Rim Berahab, an economist from the Policy Center for the New South in Rabat. Welcome.
Hi.
Next to me, Vincenzo Camporini, former Italian Defense Chief of Staff. We have connected Linus Mofor, the Senior Environmental Affairs Officer in charge of energy at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa, the Office for North Africa. We have Guido Guida, who I believe is here, the Head of International Institutional Affairs at Terna in Rome. And finally, we have Chloé Berger, a faculty advisor and researcher at the NATO Defense College in Rome. So I've raised some questions. Our speakers will be addressing this issue from various points of view. So without further ado, I would ask Rim Barahab to begin. He will speak about the link between connected energy markets, regional stability, and NATO.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your introduction. So before starting, I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of such interesting and important discussions. So as mentioned before, I will be talking about the link between connected energy markets, regional stability, and the NATO. And I will focus mainly on electricity market in the West Mediterranean area. So the global energy landscape is experiencing a significant change in terms of demand, supply, technology, market, and investment. So today, new developments, which are beyond the traditional consideration of security of oil and gas supply, are reshaping the nature of international energy cooperation and governance. And this means that connected and integrated energy industry will have to adapt to these changes. And this is particularly the case in the West Mediterranean area. So one of the main shifts that emerged in the past 10 years is the rise in renewable energy. So renewables have entered a virtuous circle of technological progress and cost reduction. So they are now becoming increasingly competitive with fossil fuels, particularly for electricity generation, with remarkable experiences from Morocco and Egypt. Also, with the European Green Deal, new potential cooperation is emerging as well in the area centered around renewable energies and particularly green electricity and hydrogen. Yet at the same time, North Africa's large oil and gas exporters face serious questions about their development models, which rely heavily on Europe for their fossil fuels revenues. So regional integration of electricity markets in the West Med region has to take into account these changes and address new challenges coming from renewables. In this sense, the concept of cross-border power grid connectivity has gained increasing support from states and international organizations, given the benefits it can offer in enhancing security of supply, lowering costs, balancing capacity, diversifying supply, as well as helping the deployment of renewable energy resources. Moreover, new technologies can be beneficial also to grid integration and enable new opportunities. For example, the evolved smart grid infrastructure with a wide storage capacity can mitigate renewable energy curtailment. However, despite all these changes and potentials, achieving a connected energy market is not a simple process. In fact, expanding trade between within North Africa and between North Africa and Europe has been hindered by inadequate physical connection, electrical connection, and poor physical integration in European electricity grid. So, an important amount of capital is needed to strengthen and expand grid interconnections while radically increasing the level of utilization of existing cross-border transmission lines. So just as an example, currently, electricity trade within North Africa has remained at modest levels. And when speaking about cross-continental electricity interconnections, the only links between Europe and North Africa, as you can see in the graph shown, are the two electricity lines with a combined nominal capacity of 1.4 gigawatts between Spain and Morocco. Although it must be noted that additional links between the two continents are being discussed, particularly Spain, another link between Morocco and Spain and Morocco and Portugal. So in addition to physical infrastructure, an effective and transparent institutional governance framework is equally as important. So this is a key prerequisite, not only for attracting private investors, but also for the regional integration to which any substantial volumes and attract new public and private traders. And this includes setting up market rules and regulations supporting fair competition, as well as implementing adequate financing mechanisms. Also, achieving level playing field requires that certain electricity trade must be based on international fuel prices, thus supporting domestic policy reforms to phase out subsidized generation fuels and end-user tariffs. So these are all prerequisites to establish a connected energy market between Europe and North Africa. So reaching all of these prerequisites can increase local workforce opportunities, promote development and stabilize migration, and consequently can enhance economic stability in the region. So what is the link with NATO, you may ask? As I mentioned earlier, the changing global energy landscape, not to mention the security threats on critical infrastructures, has once again made energy security an issue of strategic importance, particularly for NATO. And there is an aspect of civil infrastructures protection as energy is traded over global distances. So I do think that there is a role for the alliance in this area of protection of critical infrastructure, and that it can use its expertise to try to anticipate problems and to respond should there be any disaster or emergency. So to conclude, we know through international practice that developing regional institutional capacity, securing the needed financing for upgrading infrastructure, and establishing a cooperative security framework take a long time. It requires active, consistent cooperation of multiple parties, supported by political will of member states and a sound governance. And this may not be easy or fast, but this work, in my view, is essential for strengthening energy market connection, fostering the development of the region, which will in turn ensure stability. So thank you all for your attention, and I will be very happy to exchange during the discussion.
Very much. The perspective, you gave us a perspective of certain things that need to be done among the countries in the region and outside. As we go forward in the discussion, I will come back to you also after the first round, and we hope the other people, other speakers will also address the question of how we get there. It's important to set out these goals, though, that you have presented. The next speaker is Vincenzo Camporini, former Italian Defense Chief of Staff, who will speak about the geostrategic function of the Mediterranean in a context of energy transition. So I think a broader view of what our strategic view should be as we look towards this process.
Thank you for inviting me, and it's a real pleasure to exchange my views in this environment. I will say something which might seem trivial because these things are becoming more and more discussed in the public opinion and are familiar to many. But I think it is worthwhile repeating them in order to clarify and put in a wider perspective the issue of energy. It's a truism that energy is something which will be required for the future development of our societies, and it is also very clear to most of the specialists that we will be unable, at least for the next couple of decades, to rely on renewable energy sources. We had some illusions in the past, and now we have to face the reality that replace fossils, it is a process which will require a long time. And the energy required will increase. Of course, there is an effort to rationalize the use of energy, but nevertheless, the requirement will increase, and there will be a greater shift toward electrical energy. We see the revolution in the mobility with a large number of car makers relying on either hybrid or full electric means of transportation. Which means that if we today transform all the cars, all the trucks in electrical means, we will be unable to produce all the electricity which is required. So there is a requirement for energy which is going to increase in the future, and it is evident that on the northern side of the Mediterranean, in our beloved Europe, we will be unable to produce this type of energy, and we have to rely on the sources which will come from outside. from the Middle East, from the eastern countries, from Russia. But North Africa will be a place of election for providing us the energy which we require. And not only for the fossils, the energy sources which we have in the oil fields in Libya and elsewhere are essential, but also if we go to the renewables, we have areas which will be absolutely ideal to develop initiatives in order to provide us the energy which we need. But then if energy is produced, it must be transported somehow, and we have heard how this issue is a critical issue. And we have to rely on the stability of this source of energy. Stability means that there is a very strong interest, a vital interest, I would say, for the European countries to have areas in the North African region, on the Mediterranean coast and southwards, where political stability is granted. And we do not have yet this. Therefore, we will have to act in order to create this stability, which does not mean only that we have to work on the military side. Military side is just one of the means to grant this type of stability. But there must be a political effort by our nations in order to create the conditions so that the life inside these areas is such that we will not have to fear that the supply which we require will be in a way altered. It's something which is extremely important for the development of our societies and for the welfare of our societies, extremely important, and it requires the contribution and the convergence of the efforts of our countries, of our nations, which so far has been, in a way, let me be very frank, missing. We cannot expect to be effective in order to offer these populations the means to self-govern in an equitable and in a proper way, unless we converge our effort together. And we have seen that this has not happened in the recent past. Libya is a clear example where the effort of some nations were in opposition to the efforts of others, which did fuel some internal disturbances. This must stop. We need a convergence of effort. We need a convergence of all the means which we have at our disposal, starting from the diplomatic means, the economical means, and why not also the military means. And in this perspective, the role of NATO, the role of the European Union is absolutely essential, and the fact that these organizations have to work side by side is essential for the survival of our societies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, General Camporini. So we have a vital interest, and in particular Europe has a vital interest. Obviously this poses the question, as you just raised, of how to define that interest and at what level we define that interest. And in this sense, the role of international organizations certainly takes on a key role. Our next speaker is Linus Mofor, the Senior Environmental Affairs Officer in charge of energy at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, who will speak about the sustainability of the energy transition in the region. This is certainly a question which comes immediately when we speak of pushing towards sustainable energy, and at the same time you have some countries which are seeking to meet what we consider basic levels of human rights and socioeconomic development. It can create a conflict, but we'd also like to hear how this can create synergy in this direction.
So, thank you very much, Andrew. I would like to thank the NATO Foundation Defense College for inviting me to this event, a very important event. on energy transitions. As I said, my name is Linus Morfor. I'm a Senior Environmental Affairs Officer with the African Climate Policy Center of the United Nations Economic Commissioner for Africa, based here in Addis Ababa. You know, the Paris Agreement, how we deal with fossil fuels is very, very crucial in terms of how we meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And the North African countries in this region are very, very fossil fuel intensive. They have huge amounts of renewable energy and fossil fuel energy resources. There is a lot of effort going. They're also being very heavily impacted by climate change, as was mentioned in the introduction. So to then do a transition from a very fossil fuel heavy region to one that embraces new clean energy technologies is actually a very tall order. And I want to use this opportunity then to frame this context by quoting, I don't know exactly who said this, but I guess it's somebody from maybe the MENA region, who said that the humankind did not come out of the Stone Age because they ran out of stones, but because they found a better way. And our countries in the Northern Africa region are going to come out of this fossil fuel intensive economy structure, not because they're running out of fossil fuels, but because they're going to find better ways for renewables, and they are doing so. So much is happening in places like Morocco. Morocco, in fact, is only one of the very few countries globally that has been assessed as compliant to the Paris Agreement with the amount of investments that it is making in renewable energy. We've seen huge increases in wind power in Morocco, solar in Egypt, and so on. And then that means that, and then Morocco is doing a very aggressive program that is also based on increasing local content, which then addresses the issue of employment, of youth employment, of security, because without employment and development, you can't have security. So much is happening there. Morocco is also the host, as we all know, the biggest concentrated solar power plant in the world. And you may also know that the African Development Bank is promoting a program there on the Desert to Power program aimed at bringing in new capacities of about 10 gigawatts of renewables. But there are huge challenges that have to be overcome. Phasing out fossil fuels is going to be challenging. And therefore, there's urgent need for these countries to have to speed up the economic diversification that has to come. Because with the increasing pressure to phase out of fossil fuels globally, demand is falling, prices are falling. It means that these countries are also having a shrinking fiscal space from which they can generate the revenue that will be needed to invest in the clean energy that they have to do going forward. And then you also have the strange situation that in many of these countries, there are huge subsidies with very low tariffs. And that is challenging in the sense that with very low tariffs, then the revenue collection becomes very reduced, which means that there is a risk that in order to bring in new capacity to meet the increasing demand, there might be a tendency to want to fall back to the least cost generation option, which is not, of course, good as a way going forward. And of course, energy efficiency performance still remains a big challenge in the region, and these are opportunity areas that can help in the transition. I think Rim and other colleagues mentioned about the interconnections in this area, and this is really critical. Yeah? This is really critical because if we take the Egypt to Morocco interconnection, the airtime connection, you then mentioned the one going from Morocco to Spain. You also could have the ELMED that could go from Tunisia to Italy, and you consider all of this, then we have a huge opportunity, right? We have a huge opportunity because we're now able to connect North Africa and Europe, but you're not only connecting North Africa and Europe, because if you look further south from North Africa, there are other interconnectors, particularly the Zambia, Tanzania, Kenya one. If you invested and have that interconnector working, it means basically you are able to link Cape Town to Cairo, and this could have huge implications. Now, the EU has got a very high share of fossil fuels in the power mix. Similarly, the countries in this region. So they all have the same agenda. And so if EU says they're going to phase out of the fossil fuels by 2050, and this region also have to do so, given that EU also import a lot of fossil fuels from this area, which will not happen again, then we have an opportunity that through the cooperation that the SG, Deputy SG spoke about earlier and the President spoke about earlier, that through that kind of cooperation, you can substitute export of fossil fuels with export of clean energy. You can substitute import of fossil fuels with import of clean energy in Europe, and therefore Europe is able to meet its Green Deal objective. The region is able to transition from a fossil fuel by enhancing the economy, by diversifying the economy, bringing more employment, because we all know, like from the work that Irina and others do, that when you invest in renewables, you have a lot more jobs happening. And I think one of the speakers mentioned about the opportunity also for hydrogen, that we can also use abundant renewable energy resources in this area to develop a hydrogen economy. Again, that would be one way of diversifying economies, boosting employment and increasing cooperation. And that way we are all able to move towards the Paris, the goal of the Paris Agreement, and which we all know at the moment we're still far away from it, and that action is needed. So it is an opportunity story, in my opinion. It is an opportunity story where we can have a just transition that goes to keeping the global warming low, that does not decimate or destroy economies, but create new opportunities and help us to have a world that leaves no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mofor. It's interesting to hear some details here on what the trade-offs are, what the friction is between two different directions. It's something that we hear in other areas of the world too, even in the United States. It's a recurring political debate to emphasize what the opportunities are. Our next panelist is Guido Guida, the head of international institutional affairs at Terna in Rome. Terna is the manager of the Italian electricity network. So now we'll go more into some detail here from the economic side. Mr. Guida will speak about smart energy networks in the region, opportunities, risks, and challenges. Prego.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you, the organization, for, I hope you hear me well, first of all, and thank you for the organizer for this very interesting event. I'm going to describe what are the challenges on transmission system operator side in integrate renewable energy sources, and in particular, what does it mean in the Mediterranean area. Terna, so as you know, the target identified at the European level are very strong, and we expect to have a huge increase of renewable energy resources. If I refer in this case to the Italian case, we expect to have more than 40 gigawatts of additional capacity, wind and photovoltaic mainly, installed by 2030. And the challenge is to integrate these renewable energy resources in the system, and to be sure to manage, to continue to manage in a safety way the grid. Ensure the stable of the grid, operation of the grid, is really a most important a part of our work. And this is represented mainly by the fact that you need, in this case, adequate resources to cover the demand. So generate, as you can see in this video, the transmission system operator is the one that constantly balance the energy produced with the consumption. And with this huge increase of renewable energy sources, in particular, if I refer to distributed ones, there is a need to have adequate infrastructure in order to be able to transport this energy from the place where they are produced to the consumer, and avoiding, in this case, congestion. So avoiding this, that especially these renewable energy sources is cut due to the fact that the electricity infrastructure are not able to transport this energy. The second part is represented by to have to manage the system in with the adequate quality level and the security of supply. And in order to do this, this requires integration of renewable resources requires a huge amount of investment in first a grid infrastructure. Second, to invest on digitalization and innovation. And this is the plan of, in particular, of Terna. Terna approved an industrial plan at the end of past year, for which we foresee to invest around 9 billion euros for the next 5 years, in particular on the grid development, in order to renew the existing asset, but also to increase the defense mechanism we have, in order to increase the resiliency of the system. Resiliency means, in this case, action able to prevent any kind of event, or, for example, if the event occurs, to be able to restore the situation very, very fast. In this plan, I can say that the interconnection are very, very important, because interconnection with the other countries, with the neighboring countries, is fundamental. If you go step to the previous slide, please. If we refer to the interconnection, Italy has 25 interconnectors, but is planning to have additional new ones with the other countries. In particular, has been already mentioned by Linus, the Helmed project, so the one between Sicily and Tunisia. Terna is in order to do that, in order to be able, Italy represents, let me say, a natural hub for the energy, and in order to be to strongly increase the cooperation on the Mediterranean area, Terna participates and is one of the founders of the Association of the Mediterranean TSOs, that covers, is an association created in 2012, covering 19 Mediterranean countries. And the main goal of this association is to enforce the mutual cooperation among Mediterranean countries, and in particular to work in setting up a developing plan and fostering, in this case, the interconnection. The interconnection is something that has been mentioned by the previous speaker, is really one of the main important part of the plan of this association. In one of the slides you see, it's been projected. You can see that there are a lot of projects in the Mediterranean area. We are speaking about 15 projects for more than 4,000 megawatt. This is also because we have to take into account that in the national plan, in the Mediterranean plan set by METSO, the Mediterranean TSOs Association, we foresee the increase of the consumption, but also a huge increase of renewable energy sources. We are speaking by 2030 of more than 300 gigawatt. So in this case, it's important to say that in order to be able to enable this integration of energy sources, is needed to ensure a secure operation of the grid. Is really important to have a stronger network integration, and this can be made only through new interconnections. As you can see in the slide, so in the right upper side of the slide, there are a lot of projects in the different areas of the Mediterranean, and in addition to this new interconnection, we need common rules for market integration in order to manage in the appropriate way the flexible resources will be installed in the Mediterranean area, and to create the interoperability of the different power system. In Mezzo, one of the next project is really is to have a pilot project to exchange resources among the different countries, because today interconnection are used only for emergency. There are no exchange for there are no exchanges for commercial, for import-export, so to export or import renewable energy sources. But in addition, a final point on this, I would like to mention that in order to be able to develop this interconnection, we need a clear and instrument for boosting the investments in the Mediterranean area, and in this case, the European Commission can play an important role on that. At the end, few words on the Helmed project. So the link between Italy and Sicily and Tunisia is really a concrete project. We are speaking about a submarine cable of 200 kilometers, 6 megawatt for 600 million euros of investments. Today we are in a stage of authorization process, and we are performing the survey for the submarine and terrestrial survey. In conclusion, I think that this project is really important because it will allow to integrate the European and North African side. So the previous speaker spoke about the integration of northern and south part of the European and North African part, but also will create and will reinforce the grid as ensure the security of supply, and to create an electricity ring with the link between Spain and Morocco. In conclusion, I would like to say that energy is the key factor for the Mediterranean area. There is a need to have investment in transmission and grid, and the multilateral cooperation in this case is the key factor to be able to reach this goal. And on financial issues, I think that can be solved with a stable market.
If we could come back to that issue maybe in the second round. As we're over time. So thank you for that conclusion and for that overview of connections that already exist, but as we hear, are not used for commercial purposes, so there's a long way to go. Our final speaker on this panel, Chloé Berger from the NATO Defense College in Rome, will go into some of the details of some of the policy initiatives and policy questions, which I think is the obvious question that comes from what we've heard so far. Who's going to do these things? We heard one aspect from the market. Who's going to do this politically? How does this cooperation take place? So please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to the Foundation for the kind invitation. Just a little reminder or disclaimer from my side. I don't pretend to reflect neither NATO or the NDC views. Hopefully, I won't be in total contradiction with my organization, but I'm just speaking on my own quality. So thank you very much. I would like just to offer actually a few thoughts about regional integration. So because that was also the purpose of this last session, to look into the frameworks. So first of all, I would like to look at what are the parameters that have, to a certain extent, prevented the development of stable regional policy framework favoring the development of energy efficiency. And I want also here to speak about energy efficiency. That is something that has not been so much mentioned by my colleagues. And renewables. So, of course, we have discussed about the historic role played by fossil energy in the development of MENA countries at large. We know that North African countries depend heavily on fossil fuels for energy supply, but also for domestic consumption. And I guess that this is something important because it's rather new if we look at the last 50 years. So domestic consumption, as I was saying, growing rapidly due to economic growth, but also to growth, demographic growth. And finally, the pressures of urbanization, and in certain areas we can discuss or we can speak about hyper-urbanization. So this, for me, explains the current role played by fossil energy in these economies. So I've heard let's say, enthusiasm of my colleagues about renewables, but at the moment, if I'm looking at figures, and the slowly changing energy mix, okay, fossil fuels continues to supply the majority of the MENA region at large, so it's not even only North Africa. So around 98% of the region's energy mix. So we have, kind of, let's say, exceptions. Morocco is one of them. It has been several times mentioned. Israel is another one. But however, I mean, that's the current situation. Nevertheless, the energy environment is changing. We have a general decrease of resources when it comes to fossil resources, while the demand increase, as said, especially when looking at Egypt, Tunisia, prices volatility and the impact that this volatility has on fiscal resources is also a huge matter of concern for these countries. It's not only the COVID crisis, but we have seen that during the previous drop regarding oil price in 2014, 2015. Disruption of energy supply due to conflicts also, so in Libya, for instance. And of course, these short-term interruptions, they have caused recourse to international markets at a high cost to national budgets. So this is more or less what is the context and why this context creates, of course, some incentives for the governments in this region to turn to renewables or energy efficiency. So renewables, they are more attractive at the moment, but we still have some challenges. First, and my colleague said it, phasing out the fossil energy production won't be easy. Here I want to mention a specific dichotomy for me. Renewables is more relying on investment from the private sector. At the same time, when we discuss fossil energy, it's extremely linked to state actors. So we have here also a kind of, I won't say conflict, but at least friction. And so this is linked to something that is more general in the region, is the relationship, and we need to rethink that, between state actors and non-state actors. And at the moment, I mean, all the changes that we have seen over the last decade, they were very much about, how civil societies intend to renegotiate this relationship. So here there is a huge governance problem that needs to be solved, or solutions, let's say compromises that need to be found in order to accompany the development of these renewables. So this is probably one reason why we don't see incentives for developing energy efficiency or renewables to private sectors at the moment. So there is, of course, a kind of political will, but for the moment, there is no tools. So the questions that lie ahead, they are the question of the reform of the structure of the economy. So we have discussed about subsidies, but also the rentier state model. The energy sector managed by state-owned actors. we have also the problem of investment, so foreign direct investments, and so the energy sector needs huge investments, but those are in majority foreign direct investments from countries like China or Russia that have obviously geopolitical interest. So this is also part of the conundrum. There are also political obstacles to the development of a regional integration process. We have seen that we have integration between North and South, but when it comes to North African economic integration, it's still something that needs to be worked out. Finally, getting to private sectors, so there is an absence of regulatory framework that actually is attractive for bank and private sectors. So having said that, some opportunities exist. We have seen that the Arab League has launched actually plans in that direction. Mediterranean countries, they have actually adopted objectives linked to Paris climate agreement. We have seen all the interconnections that already exist between these countries. So what is missing now? What is missing is definitely to develop energy efficiency and renewable standards, national but also regional ones, if we want to have an integrated market. We need to have energy transition legislation with long-term objectives for renewables. Explore ways to reform energy subsidy mechanism and diversify fiscal incomes for rentier states. And so this is a huge challenge. Finally, establishing an enabling framework for attracting private sector investors, and not only local one, but foreign one too, and explore trust-building measures among North African countries to develop a more regional approach to energy security. And so I want to end on that. This will probably require to discuss seriously what can international organizations like NATO or the EU can do in order to try to solve out the disagreement between Morocco and Algeria, because there will never be any economic regional integration if these two leaders are not really, speaking to each other.
Okay, thank you. So it comes back to politics. We have political questions. You raised many very interesting points, I think. The question of efficiency, the question of what is the mix today, how far away we are, and China. Finally, someone mentioned China, obviously, which is a very key question of where this money is coming from, who's going to drive this process, and that's a big issue in terms of strategic weight, as we've seen over many years and decades, and which is creating global competition right now, defining, by the way, also the agenda of NATO as we move forward. Now we have time for a second round of brief interventions, a couple minutes each. I will ask you a question, but feel free to comment on anything from before that you didn't get a chance to say because you stayed within the time mostly. So we will go back to Wim Berahab. You mentioned capital, financing, which is needed. Where can this come from? This is tied to what we were just talking about. How can states do something internally, or do they need to wait from the outside, someone to come from the outside to help them?
Thank you. This is a very important question, actually, because financing has also been one of the major challenges, not only in terms of renewable energy deployments, but in terms of the profound transformation of the energy sector as well as the economic sector broadly. So I think that both the government as well as international finance institutions, development banks, but also the private sector could pitch in. This is why it is very important to have a framework, a regulatory and legal framework that encourages those interactions, and that it encourages also the involvement of the private sector. And if you may, I will just give also the example of Morocco. So it has been brought up a lot by the speakers, and indeed, as you all know, Morocco is blessed with abundant natural resources. But what the country lacks in hydrocarbon, it is compensated by rich solar and wind potentials. And important lessons can be drawn from this country. So, in addition to, particularly in terms of financing, so. In addition to setting long-term targets, Morocco sought to provide the legal and regulatory framework to roll out its broader transition strategy that aims first and foremost at market creation. So since then, subsequent legislation was passed that allows tendering and auctions for large-scale solar and wind projects, encouraging particularly private investments in the sector. So other enablers of success focus on fostering investor and lender confidence by ensuring strong institutional off-takers and increasing institutional capacity. And one of the good examples of this was the creation of what we can call a one-stop shop agency, which is the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Development. Yes, which organizes auctions to select developers based on a wide range of criteria, provides land and infrastructure as well as permitting, but most importantly provides a dual PPA procurement model that optimizes risk allocation between the private and the public sector. So I think that this shows us that there is an important need for those kinds of framework that also shares the risks between government and private sectors and international finance institutions in order to encourage those kinds of interactions and dynamics.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, certainly the question of this interaction, public-private, comes up repeatedly in this area when we have an overarching political goal, which we've defined at a societal level, and then we have to bring economic actors along. I come back to Vincenzo Camporini. Chloe Berger mentioned China. You mentioned a vital interest, that Europe has a vital interest in North Africa, but maybe others have a vital interest there too, or they think they do. Certainly the United States considered for many years a vital interest in terms of energy in the Middle East. That has changed somewhat, given the energy revolution in the United States at this point. There are other players. China is a major one. Russia is obviously very active in the Middle East in this period. Can you tell us about what influences can push this process forward or derail it?
Yes, you are right. There is a very strong competition because Africa is seen as a source of a lot of things which are required. Minerals, energy, workforce, and there is a competition between many countries, many sources of power to have the upper hand. I have to say that the political effort by China has been extremely effective. China evidently does not care very much about many issues which are in the main agenda of the Western world, of course human rights and the welfare of the countries where they operate. They have just a kind of commercial interest which support their strategic interest. And they have been extremely effective and wise in their action in the last few years, I would say the last decades. That's why I reiterate the fact that if we want to be a successful competitor in order to safeguard our interest, we must have a very coherent action by the countries in Europe, by the Western world as a whole, because otherwise the competition between us will impede the effectiveness of our efforts. I strongly support any effort to have a common vision in Europe, which so far has not been very clear, and the result has been a less effective action by our countries and the weakness of our position. We need to make some step forward, and I see some signs that this evidence is becoming very clear to our leaders. I hope that they will continue along this trend. Thank you.
It does seem that in Europe there are, geographically, there are different approaches. In Italy and the southern rim countries certainly have a direct interest in the connection. Germany is connecting somewhere else. Excuse me. Is it possible to have a coherent strategy, or does it have to be differentiated within a?
It is not only possible, but it is needed because, in particular, energy is something which can flow along the routes at a greater speed. Let's talk about gas. Gas coming from Russia is spread throughout Europe, as well the gas coming from Libya or from Algeria. The network of the pipelines is such that it does not matter where the commodity comes from. So the interest of Germany is similar to the interest of Italy and of Spain. And I strongly hope that our leaders will consider this point of view and will become more aware that the fact that either we stand together or we will fall together.
The hope for the future. Now, Mr. Mofor, to come back to you, the question I had listening to your talk, to your intervention is, in your view, what are the biggest obstacles to the implementation of the Paris agreements, or at least moving forward in the countries you mentioned? Where does the resistance come from? But please go on and intervene on the other topics as well.
No, thank you very much, Andrew. It's a very good question, and one important conversation in implementation of the Paris Agreement is this issue of just transition. Right, we're talking about decarbonizing or moving a region that is very highly dependent on fossil fuels to a clean energy, and we have to do that in a just way. But we need to understand what is that just transition. If you take, for example, that Germany is asking for maybe 18 years to come out of coal completely. EU is asking for 30 years or so to decarbonize, and we need to then have a conversation with our countries in North Africa especially, that what would be a just transition so that we can all stay focused on meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. Because without doing that, because there is a lot of conversation now going on, and you're hearing so many people saying, you have to divest fully from fossil fuels, you have to do this and that. The EU Green Deal is talking about the carbon border adjustment, all of these issues. I think we need to have these conversations in a very pragmatic, sober way. Otherwise, as you say, Andrew, you're going to get into a situation where people retrench into their defensive positions rather than having a common position, because we have one common fate. Climate change has no boundaries. Some people are more capable to respond to it. Some people are not able to. But we need to have this conversation in a very well thought out way. I had a mention of gas. In North Africa, there's a lot of gas. A lot of the power mix in North Africa is gas. So how do we then talk about meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement, divesting from gas, if we don't do it in a way that is just, so that these economies can have time to transition? And in any case, if you're going to have a lot more wind and a lot more solar, then we need this strong grids, right? If we have these very strong interconnected grids, then that will be very important, so that those grids will also be supported by base generation from gas and so on. So I think this issue of just transition is very important on how we address it, and so that countries can have a very comfortable way, knowing that, of course, everybody is geared to the idea that we should go to net zero, we should meet the objective of the Paris Agreement. So I think having this focus and too much narrative on immediately saying divesting from fossil fuels without thinking on how do we do it in a way that makes it possible for us to achieve the Paris Agreement rather than do it in a way that defranchise people and then people retrench into defensive positions that are catastrophic for all of us. But another issue which I think I should also mention here is that on the 1st of January this year, something really amazing happened, because that was the day that the Africa Continental Free Trade came into operation. So if we're talking about how Europe is going to interact with the Mediterranean region and the southern countries in North Africa, we also have to keep that in mind, right? We're going to have one or the largest free trade bloc, and that would also include trade in energy. And if we're talking about clean energy and the energy future, we also then have to think on how does the Africa Continental Free Trade and an integrated African power system has an impact on all of this relation on the energy strategies between Europe and North Africa or the Mediterranean region.
Very interesting. If Africa does become a trading bloc, then the question is not so much the connection of one part of Africa with Europe, but Africa more as a bloc. Very interesting. Thank you. We'll move on now. We have a lot of questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to, as I ask each panelist to intervene again, I'm going to ask you a question also coming from the audience. We have about 20 minutes left, so a few minutes each, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. For Mr. Guida, I know you had a point you wanted to mention on finance from before. We have a question, how Terna is managing the project in North Africa with the great instability in the area.
What we are doing is to coordinate first of all national development Mediterranean development plan, and taking in the account also the increase and where the renewable energy sources should be located, and this we should be taking into account what could be the future, but also to work together on what are the market rules. So the way in which, for example, also with the knowledge sharing on the way today, for example, in Italy, we manage the instability of the grid represented by the presence of renewable energy sources, and so to try to have and to put on this side the experience we have, and try to share the knowledge, and to have a pilot project in order to have a similar approach in the Mediterranean, in the North African side. This is one of the way which we try to manage the situation.
Thank you. I'd ask you if you can to turn your microphone off for a moment as we move on to the other speakers. The next question from Ms. Berger: how could the fragilities inherent in Mediterranean countries affect the alliance's security? I assume the alliance.
So the fragility of the instability in North Africa, how at large?
The partners to the Mediterranean dialogue. Yeah.
Okay.
A general question.
That's a very general question. So I will try to restrict a bit, or to narrow the question to actually let's say the energy sector or what is related. So of course, I think that it's quite obvious when we look at the migrant crisis. This is only one aspect of this instability. So here we see a direct and clear, let's say, consequence of this instability in North Africa affecting the security of the alliance. Of course, the alliance has this idea that the security of the alliance cannot just stop at our borders. Why? Because if we go and we consider that the Med is, the border where we just, defense, if it's only about collective defense and deterrence, when the problem reached the Med, instability reached the Mediterranean, actually it's already there in the alliance. So the idea is that we have, of course, to consider first what are the root causes of this instability, and try as much as possible in NATO's let's say areas of expertise to support our partners in North Africa. Now, the root causes of this instability, and so discussing instability in the region at large, are of course most of the time not really military or security issues per se. A lot of these issues has to deal with governance issues at large. The problem of how you reform certain, let's say, governance model. And so here, speaking about energy security, speaking, for example, about an example like Algeria, you understand that in the current context, how can Algeria, which is heavily relying on the incomes derived from gas, from fossil resources, how can Algeria just, suddenly turn to renewables? So that's really, part of this conundrum. When we discuss now about energy transition, we need to understand what are the socio-economic costs of this huge transition. It's, like for Europe, it's, of course, changing from, a societal model to another one. And, of course, there is no reason that it's not the same for these countries. Having said that, we understand that Europe has a huge interest to push for this transition. On the North African side, and that's where I'm less enthusiastic than my colleagues, I understand the interest in the long-term energy, transition is important from the climate change point of view, but at the same time, we need to consider what are the challenges for these countries. What are the challenges in already a very challenging time where these countries need to rework, or they are actually the governments, they are compelled to renegotiate the social contract. And with the social contract comes the idea of what is the role of the state, what is, a public good, how you redistribute, actually public resources. And here, the energy sector is key, is at the core of, this conundrum. So that's why, for me, probably one aspect of this energy transition is probably to identify niche. We need to identify niche where, and it would be much more easier, much more in line with the idea that we have private investors also, investing in specific areas. It will be easier also to define, good, let's say, framework to encourage the investors. So probably going, from a bottom-top approach and not trying to actually push these countries to adopt a top-bottom approach and dismantling, their state-owned companies. We have seen in, Central Europe that actually all this huge movement of economic transition based on the privatization of a lot of state-owned companies was actually quite tricky, to be very careful.
Shock therapy has problems. With electricity, shock therapy could be even more dangerous. This is certainly I think this is a very important point. The question of how you get countries to move in this direction because it's better, something that Mr. Mofor mentioned. You have to change because it's better, not because someone came outside and gave you their political goal or an ideological goal in some cases, such as free market shock therapy, which you just mentioned. And it really is a question then of, you spoke about bottom-up, creating niches, encouraging the private sector. How do we get the private sector to do it? Not because, again, not because we say you have to do it from the outside, but it actually becomes advantageous for both sides. We will move around again and come back to Rim Barahab. We have a specific question which I think you can take. Do you think that the Moroccan solar program could be a model for Africa?
So this is a very good question. Let me just premise this by saying that, while energy transition is now inevitable, it is very complex because there is no universal strategy applicable to all countries. And I do agree with many of the points that Chloe has brought up, because if we look at it, we see that countries who are net energy importers like Morocco and do not have hydrocarbon resources have a bigger incentive to achieve energy transition. And now speaking about the case of Morocco, there are, I believe that there are some lessons that can be drawn, but we have to be very careful and not just try to apply them everywhere, because we need to take into consideration the socioeconomic circumstances of the country in questions, as well as their regulatory and legal framework. Now, if we look at Morocco, so what Morocco did is that early on in 2009, it introduced a national energy strategy that tries to reconcile between economic development and sustainability of the environment. And it adopted, and one of the main objectives of the strategy was to achieve a secure energy supply and thus lessen its dependence on energy import, as well as diversify the energy mix of Morocco. And try also one other point that it tried to push is also to create externalities from this big project that Morocco undertook for renewable energies. So we see that since 2016, it has launched one of North Africa's biggest solar power plants in South Morocco, the Ouarzazate power plant. And since then, it has launched many other renewable energy, mainly wind and solar CSP. And now, given the cost competitiveness of PV, it tries to incorporate more PV plants backed up by some hydro storage as well. So what we can learn from Morocco's experience, and I mentioned some of the points before, was this framework reforms that Morocco has undertook. So beyond the points that I have mentioned before in the creation of the Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Development, Morocco has also introduced some laws to increase the penetration of renewable energies. The main one is Law 1309, which opened up the electricity markets or electricity generated from renewable energies, so that big producers can sell the excess electricity that they're produced, which was a big step. But then again, there are a lot of things that we need to overcome as well. So just as an example, in 2019, 20% of Morocco's electricity generated was from renewable energies, but it still depends highly not on gas, but rather on coal. And we have now more ambitious targets towards increasing the share of renewable energy. But with that, there is a lot of challenges that arise, because variable renewable energy sources poses the challenge of power flexibility. So this is also something that we need to take into consideration. Just for example, there are 4 widely known categories of infrastructure assets that can provide system flexibility. The first one is the dispatchable power plants, and now we're talking about also distributed generation. The second one is electricity network and interconnections, which has been the topic of our session today. There is also energy storage. and distributed energy resources, including demand-side response. But historically, conventional power plants using mainly coal for Morocco, electricity network and pump storage have been the primary source of flexibility. So accommodating for these new sources of flexibility requires changes in policy, markets, and regulation. So we cannot provide standard solution to every country. On the contrary, solutions need to be adapted, as I said. And when talking about regional integration, it must be recognized that such transformation would also involve complex geopolitical issues, as it has been mentioned before, which could take time to negotiate and reach mutually beneficial inter-regional agreements.
It's into another question, but first I want to get to General Camporini. We have time for the remaining 4 speakers to answer a quick question, about 2 minutes each, so please try to be quick. We have a specific question for General Camporini. About Italy. Italy has a clear strategic role. So what tools could Rome use, either both European and transatlantic, to be more effective in this area?
Well, the first means Italy must use, and which I'm afraid has not been used in the recent past, is a sound diplomacy, a sound foreign policy, an active role in shaping the agenda of the European Union. This is my personal view, and I take responsibility for that. We have not been leaders in this field. We have been followers of other initiatives, which could be in our interest or could be against our interest. So I think that we need a sound foreign policy to go back to being the main character of our attitude. If we do so, I believe that we will be able to become the nucleus of a common foreign policy, at least for the region, between the main countries of Europe, and we will become effective, which has not been the case in the past.
Now for Mr. Mofor, we have an interesting question. It would take a lot longer to answer than 2 minutes, but the question essentially is it easier to promote a culture of sustainable development in less developed countries or in countries that already use oil? That is it easier to leapfrog towards sustainable energy, or to get countries which already have a certain level of development and wealth to move forward?
No, thank you, Andrew. It's a very important question. Leapfrogging is very good. It's very important. We have seen how it works. We've seen it in the telecommunications in Africa, where African countries have actually leapfrogged and have gone so far ahead without putting in place a single hardwired or hardcore infrastructure. So leapfrogging is important, but then to leapfrog, you need to be sure that you don't leap and then fall in the wrong place. So, and that you need to be sure that you have enough energy in yourself to leap, to take you where you want to land. Otherwise, it could be even more catastrophic. So leapfrogging is important, but we have to do it in a very well thought out manner. And that is why here in the Economic Commission for Africa, we have established an initiative called the SDG 7 Initiative for Africa, because to do the investment, to do the transition, you need investments. And as has been mentioned, the investments are very small, especially from the private sector. According to the global trends on renewable energy investment by Frankfurt School and UNEP and so on, of the 282 billion of clean energy investments globally in 2019, less than 1.5% of that came to Africa, right? And then we're talking about the transition. So where will the money come from? It has to come from the private sector. And especially we talked about COVID has caused a lot of shrinking of the physical space and revenue issues and so on. But then how would the private sector come? They need to have the enabling environment for the investments to happen. So we have this initiative built on 3 pillars. The one is on sustainability, that you can use the Paris Agreement as an entry point. You can enhance your NDCs with more clean energy actions that are bankable so that they can attract private sector investments. But for those who come, you have to address the governance issue. And in fact, we are working with Race for Africa, NL Foundation, and others to work with our member states, including in North Africa, to address these issues of governance so that the private sector investments can happen. When these issues are addressed, then we feel that it's much easier now to go to the capital markets and raise monies through bonds and so on. So yes, you can leapfrog, but you have to think about it carefully. But you have to think about where would the investments come from. There is a jigsaw that everybody has their role to play. The private sector has their role to play. The governments have their role to play. The development partners have their role to play, and say, if we're going to make these transformative investments happen, we then also need to make the cost of capital affordable. We need to think about innovations in financing, blended finance, and so forth. But our executive secretary, Mr. Vera Songwe, is also launching something called Team Energy Africa. That if you're going to get the private sector, you can also have to think about the private sector in Africa, the private sector in North Africa. You have big entrepreneurs on the continent, in the region, who could also be transformative. They can work easier with the government to make the reforms that are needed. Then they can also link easily to the foreign private sector so that you can leverage the influence on making the regulation or the governance happen, and leverage the global agenda and development partners to make the finance happen. So yes, leapfrogging is important. It is the way to go, but we have to do it carefully, and we have to design the leapfrogging properly so that you leap and you land where you're supposed to be. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Guida, I'm going to ask you the most popular question here on from our audience today. It's a little bit political, but it regards economics. What do you think of an EU-Africa agreement on carbon pricing? What kind of effect would that have, and is it desirable?
I think that this could be a way to try to manage the issue. I know that, as also Claude said, today the generation is mainly due to the traditional production. So this kind of agreement, I think that is very well welcomed, as well as, let me say, it's important also to be sure that, for example, EU can do agreement and can support the investments, in particular, let me say, in North Africa. I'm referring in particular to the new TNE regulation. This is, I think, a way that can bring to identify the most important project that then can be financed by with the granted call. So I think not only carbon, but also other instruments that really can support development in North Africa, and this, I think, is important to give a voice on this side. Also, because if I refer, so I work on the energy sector, and particularly and electricity. Today, European level, they only speak about, for example, all the hydrogen, the wind farm on the north and the North Sea. The voice and the needs on the Mediterranean area are not well addressed, I think. And also, if, let me say, the Commission speaks about the external dimension of the Green Deal and of the regulation they are put in place. But let me say, the Mediterranean area is not always well managed.
Thank you. Very briefly, 30 seconds. Can renewable energies bring more stability?
That's a huge question. Now, honestly, in 30 seconds, I guess that's a huge hope for everybody, for both shores of the Mediterranean. There is for sure a lot of prospects that are linked to the development of these renewables. It's about innovation. And so innovation also, that can support more development in, both sides of the Med. So from that point, of course, renewables can bring more stability. I think that the interconnection between, also both sides of the Mediterranean, linking, our common destiny to one project is, of course, and prosperity is, of course, something that can enable, stability. Now we have seen over these last 2 days that there are a couple of challenges that stay, lie behind this idea, but probably our governments, they are working on it, hopefully.
It seems safe to say that innovation and prosperity are certainly preconditions to move towards true sustainability. Otherwise, we're unlikely to get there. I'd like to thank, first of all, the panelists, excellent panelists. I think we've had a great discussion. Rim Berahab, Vincenzo Camporini, Linus Mofor, Guido Guida, and Chloe Berger. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have this talk with you. I would ask Ambassador Alessandro Minuto Rizzo to come up to close the conference for us.
Buon pomeriggio a tutti. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are at the end of the works of this conference. We had two, as you've seen two panels yesterday. One very interesting one today, and really I applaud to Mr. Spanhaus and the others, because it has been a very interesting discussion. At the end of our works, I would like to say that we have been very lucky in a way, and very happy also for what I think is a success, because we know that more than 300 people, I understand, I don't know exactly the number, has been connected with us. And in these times of pandemic, this is very important. The foundation will continue in the future to address key strategic issues in a way, that's how we think, in a way that must be simple, that must be comprehensive, and must be understood by the general public. This is not a discussion for specialists. We want everybody to see why we talk about these issues and the way we speak about that. I would like to thank, of course, first of all, the director and the girls and boys of the foundation for their work, for their enthusiasm, because it's really a pleasure to work with them. And I also like to thank the speakers, the moderators. Andrew came from Milan this morning, for instance. We had people coming from different countries, from different angles. Somebody here physically, others virtual. We did what we could. I hope the final result is pleasant, is interesting for the general public. I think that I should also thank those who really supported us in terms of making this conference possible. And I mean, of course, Philip Morris International, the Science for Peace and Science Program, and our partner, the Policy Center for the South in Rabat. I think that this is how we should end this conference. I would like also, this is the last thing, to inform you that in fact you have seen us, I mean, here on the podium, let's say, and people speaking from, a screen, television, but behind us we have a studio really. We have a lot of people that we have engaged who have been working to make this conference at those hours interesting and also pleasant, with something, with some movie, with some sentence, with some expression of geography, something nice. So in conclusion, thank you very much, grazie mille a tutti e buon pomeriggio a tutti.